The year was 1890. America, a young nation, wrestled with growing pains. Westward expansion, a symphony of progress for some, played a mournful tune for others. Native Americans, sometimes called American Indians or First Americans, are the indigenous peoples of the United States. The original inhabitants of this vast lands witnessed their world shrink with each passing sunset. The European colonization of the Americas that began in 1492 resulted in a decline in the size of the Native American population because of newly introduced diseases, including weaponized diseases and biological warfare by European colonizers. The decline of Native American populations was rapid and severe, probably the greatest demographic disaster ever. Smallpox epidemics are thought to have caused the greatest loss of life for indigenous populations. Historians have classified this colonization as comprising genocide. As part of a policy of white settler colonialism, European settlers continued to wage war and perpetrated massacres against Native American peoples, removed them from their ancestral lands and subjected them to one-sided government treaties and discriminatory government policies. The sexual abuse of indigenous children in boarding schools was perpetrated by the administrators of these programs. Teachers, nuns and priests performed these acts upon their students. Children were touched and molested to be used as pleasure by these mentors who were supposed to educate them. Several mentors considered these students as objects and sexually abused them by forming rotations to switch in and out whenever they were done sexually tormenting the next student. These adults also used sexual abuse as a form of embarrassment towards each other. This act created a majority among the children who were victims in silence. This recurred in boarding schools across the nation in different scenarios. These include boys being sexually assaulted on their birthdays to girls being forcibly taken at night by the priest to be used as objects. Treaties, signed and broken, painted a bleak picture of betrayal. In the years leading up to the conflict, the US government had continued to seize Lakota lands. The once large bison herds of the Great Plains, a staple of the Plains Indians, had been hunted to near extinction. When the United States was established, Native American tribes were generally considered semi-independent nations because they generally lived in communities which were separate from communities of white settlers. The Lakota, once proud guardians of the Black Hills, felt the icy grip of despair. Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and admitted to these boarding schools. They were forced to abandon their cultural traditions and were taught about American ideas of refinement and civilization. The discovery of gold in the Black Hills, a sacred land to the Lakota, ignited a firestorm of greed. Promises were made, then shattered, as the US government, driven by the insatiable hunger for wealth and land, encroached further upon Native American territory. This set the stage for a tragedy that would forever stain the conscience of a nation, the Wounded Knee Massacre. The Lakota, forced onto the reservation after years of broken treaties and dwindling resources, clung to a desperate hope: the ghost dance. A ceremony incorporated into numerous Native American belief systems. This spiritual movement, a blend of traditional beliefs, promised a return to a world before the white man, a time of plentiful buffalo and freedom. The basis for the ghost dance is the circle dance, a traditional Native American dance. Usually the dancers are accompanied by a group of singers who may also play hand drums in unison. The dancers join hands to form a large circle. Word of the ghost dance spread like wildfire across the reservations. To the Lakota, it was a lifeline. A prayer whispered on the wind. The way of life of these independent people was rapidly fading. US settlers were alarmed by the sight of the many Great Basin and Plains tribes performing the ghost dance, worried that it might be a prelude to armed attack. The US Army in November arrived on Lakota reservations with the goal of stopping the rise of the ghost dance. Stationed at Standing Rock Agency is where Chief Sitting Bull lived. Sitting Bull was a powerful Hunkpapa Lakota leader who led his people during years of resistance against United States government policies. US officials decided to take some of the chiefs into custody in order to quell what they called the Messiah craze. Rumors of an impending uprising spread like wildfire. The US government viewed the ghost dance as a potential uprising and a threat to their control over Native American tribes. Tensions escalated as government officials sought to suppress the movement. The ghost dance, a plea for peace and a return to a lost way of life, was twisted into a war dance, a prelude to violence. This fear, fueled by prejudice and misunderstanding, set in motion a chain of events that would culminate in unimaginable tragedy. The police surrounded Sitting Bull's home to arrest him, fearing he might support and lead the ghost dance movement. Sitting Bull and his wife noisily protested in order to stall for time, which caused a crowd to converge on the scene. When Sitting Bull refused to comply, the police forced him. The Lakota in the village were enraged. A Lakota shouldered his rifle and shot the police, who reacted by firing his revolver into the chest of Sitting Bull, instantly killing him. The killing of Sitting Bull, a revered Lakota leader and a powerful symbol of resistance, further inflamed tensions. His death, a tragic misunderstanding fueled by paranoia, sent shockwaves through the Lakota community. Fearful and leaderless, after Sitting Bull's death, 200 members of his Hunkpapa band, fearful of reprisals, fled Standing Rock to join the camp of Chief Spotted Elk, known as Bigfoot, and his band at the Cheyenne River Indian Reservation. Spotted Elk and his band sought safety and left the Cheyenne River Reservation on December 23 to journey to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation to seek shelter with Red Cloud. Red Cloud was a leader of the Oglala Lakota from 1865 to 1909. Oglala Lakota is one of the sub-tribes of the Lakota people. Red Cloud was one of the most capable Native American opponents whom the United States Army faced in the Western Territories. In late December 1890, Chief Spotted Elk of the Minneconjou Lakota people, along with 350 followers, were stopped by a cavalry unit led by U.S. officer Samuel Whitside while en route to convene with the remaining Lakota chiefs. U.S. Army officers forced him to relocate with his people to a small camp close to the Pine Ridge Agency. Here the soldiers could more closely watch the old chief, but their every move was shadowed by suspicion, their pleas for peace drowned out by the drumbeat of fear. The U.S. Army, dispatched to intercept the Lakota, saw not families seeking shelter but potential enemies. That night, December 28th, the small Lakota group set up their tipis by Wounded Knee Creek. The next day, officers tried to take the Lakota's weapons. A young Lakota warrior, Black Coyote, who was deaf, wouldn't give up his gun, claiming he had paid a lot for it. A fight broke out, and a gun went off in the air. The stage was set for a tragic clash of cultures fueled by mistrust, fear, and a profound disconnect. The road to Wounded Knee was paved with the best intentions gone awry, a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of prejudice and misunderstanding. Shootout erupted between the two sides. One U.S. officer gave the command to open fire, and the Lakota responded by taking up previously confiscated weapons, but many had already been stripped of their guns and disarmed. The Lakota, weary and seeking refuge, believed they were under the protection of the U.S. government, that their surrender would be met with compassion. They were tragically mistaken. As the soldiers attempted to disarm the Lakota, a shot rang out. Whether accidental or intentional, it ignited a firestorm of violence. At first, all firing was at close range. Half the Lakota men were killed or wounded before they had a chance to get off any shots. While the Lakota warriors and soldiers were shooting at close range, other soldiers used the Hotchkiss guns against the teepee camp full of women and children. Some women and children attempted to flee the scene and sought protection in a nearby ravine, but the Hotchkiss guns fired on their position. Some of the Lakota grabbed rifles from the piles of confiscated weapons and opened fire on the soldiers. Some of the soldiers fanned out and finished off the wounded. The snow-covered ground, stained crimson with the blood of innocents, stood as a silent witness to the brutality that unfolded. The massacre at Wounded Knee, a one-sided slaughter, lasted less than an hour. When the smoke cleared and the echoes of gunfire faded, over 300 Lakota lay dead, their bodies covered with bullets. The frozen ground absorbed their dreams, leaving behind a legacy of pain and sorrow. US Army unceremoniously buried hundreds of dead bodies in a mass grave where the Hotchkiss guns had been placed, a location today known as Cemetery Hill. The aftermath of the massacre was a tapestry woven with threads of despair, anger, and defiance. The Lakota, reeling from the unimaginable loss, mourned their dead and grappled with the shattered remnants of their world. The news of the massacre sent shockwaves across the nation and beyond. While some lauded the Army's actions, others were horrified. Questions were raised, investigations launched, but true justice remained elusive. The massacre at Wounded Knee marked the end of an era, the final, tragic chapter in the long and bloody conflict between the US government and the Plains Indians. It stood as a stark reminder of the human cost of westward expansion, a tragic testament to the devastating consequences of broken treaties, cultural misunderstanding, and unchecked prejudice. In the wake of the massacre, public outcry demanded justice for the victims. The government's response was a mix of half-hearted investigations and justifications for the Army's actions. The US government continued to use the threat of violence to suppress the ghost dance at Lakota reservations, Pine Ridge, Rosebud, Cheyenne River, and Standing Rock. Soldiers involved were hailed as heroes by some, while others condemned their actions. Official investigations, clouded by political expediency, failed to hold those responsible accountable. In 1830, the US Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, authorizing the federal government to relocate Native Americans from their homelands within established states to lands west of the Mississippi River, in order to accommodate continued European-American expansion. This resulted in what amounted to the ethnic cleansing or genocide of many tribes who were subjected to brutal forced marches. After the Indian Wars in the late 19th century, the government established Native American boarding schools, initially run by Christian missionaries. They were given white names, had their hair cut and traditional clothing taken away, were forced to speak English and beaten when they would not comply. They were forced to practice Christianity and not allowed to practice their indigenous religions, and in numerous other ways forced to abandon their Native American identities. At this time, the majority of non-Native American society thought that Native American children needed to be acculturated to the mainstream society and assimilated into white culture. Bounties were offered for students who tried to run away, and many students committed suicide. Since the rise of self-determination for Native Americans and the revealing of the abuse that took place at the boarding schools, Native American communities now have their own schools, many of which additionally include tribal languages and culture and tribal history in the curriculum. Beginning in the 1970s, tribes have also founded colleges at their reservations, controlled and operated by Native Americans, to educate youth for jobs as well as to pass on their cultures. Historically, Wounded Knee is generally considered to be the end of the collective multi-century series of conflicts between colonial and US forces and American Indians, known collectively as the Indian Wars. It was not, however, the last armed conflict between Native Americans and the United States. The massacre cast a long shadow over the relationship between the US government and Native American communities. Trust, shattered by bullets and broken promises, proved difficult to rebuild. The scars of Wounded Knee ran deep, impacting generations of Native Americans, shaping their identity and their struggle for recognition and self-determination. Since the 1960s, Native American self-determination movements have resulted in positive changes to the lives of many Native Americans, though there are still many contemporary issues faced by them. Today, there are over 5 million Native Americans in the United States, 78% of whom live outside reservations. The echoes of Wounded Knee resonated through the decades, fueling the fight for tribal sovereignty, cultural preservation, and social justice. In a study conducted in 2006-2007, non-Native Americans admitted they rarely encountered Native Americans in their daily lives. In 2021, members of the US Congress petitioned President Joe Biden to revoke the Medals of Honor soldiers received for their participation in the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre. Beginning in 1986, the group named Bigfoot Memorial Riders was formed, where they will go to continue to honor the dead. The ceremony has attracted more participants each year, and riders and their horses live with the cold weather, as well as the lack of food and water, as they retrace the path that their family members took to Wounded Knee. The Wounded Knee massacre exposed the dark underbelly of westward expansion, revealing the human cost of manifest destiny. The government's policies towards Native Americans, rooted in paternalism and a misguided belief in their own cultural superiority, had devastating consequences. The reservation system, designed to control and confine Native Americans, stripped them of their land, their livelihoods, and their cultural identity. The forced removal of Native American children from their families and their placement in boarding schools where they were forbidden from speaking their language or practicing their traditions aimed to erase their cultural heritage. These policies, designed to civilize Native Americans, resulted in generations of trauma, loss, and cultural disruption. Most people had only a vague understanding of the problems facing Native Americans today. For their part, Native Americans told researchers that they believed they continued to face prejudice, mistreatment, and inequality in the broader society. The path to reconciliation is long and arduous, paved with the difficult work of acknowledging the past, honoring the victims, and learning from the mistakes of history. It requires a fundamental shift in perspective, one that recognizes the inherent rights and sovereignty of Native American tribes. In recent years, there has been a growing movement to acknowledge the injustices of the past and to work towards a more just and equitable future for Native American communities. Memorials have been erected, apologies issued, and efforts made to preserve Native American languages and cultures. The healing process is ongoing, requiring a continued commitment to listening to the voices of Native Americans, understanding their perspectives, and working together to address the systemic inequalities they continue to face. The difficulties that Native Americans face in the workforce, for example, a lack of promotions and wrongful terminations, are attributed to racial stereotypes and implicit biases. Native American business owners are seldom offered auxiliary resources that are crucial for entrepreneurial success. Throughout history, settler colonialism has remained a violent and destructive tool to displace and exterminate Native American peoples. The use of sexual violence to perpetuate this is very common. Musocki Creek law professor Sarah Deer highlights the high number of Native women who still experience this violence. Since 1999, a variety of reports and studies have come to the same conclusion, namely that Native women in particular suffer the highest rate of per capita rape in the United States. The continued acts of sexual violence against Native women have been perpetuated by colonization and the actions of colonizers. The voices of those who perished at Wounded Knee, silenced by violence and indifference, continue to whisper across the generations. Their stories, passed down through oral traditions and historical accounts, serve as a powerful reminder of the human cost of prejudice and the enduring legacy of trauma. It is our responsibility to listen to these voices, to learn from the mistakes of the past, and to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated. The subjects of genuine American Indian blood, cultural connection, and recognition by the community are extremely contentious issues, hotly debated throughout Indian country and beyond. The whole situation, some say, is ripe for misinterpretation, confusion, and exploitation. We must confront the uncomfortable truths of our history, acknowledging the role that racism, greed, and cultural arrogance played in shaping the events at Wounded Knee. The lessons of Wounded Knee are as relevant today as they were over a century ago. Some scholars argue that the existing practices of economic development are not suitable for Native American communities, given the lifestyle, economic, and cultural differences, as well as the unique history of Native American-US relations. In the 20th century, early portrayals of Native Americans in movies and television roles were first performed by European Americans dressed in mock traditional attire. The importance of understanding and respecting different cultures and the need to address the root causes of injustice. By honoring the memory of those who suffered and perished at Wounded Knee, we commit ourselves to creating a more just and compassionate world for all. Little economic development research has been conducted on Native American communities. The federal government fails to consider place-based issues of American Indian poverty by generalizing the demographic. Mary Peltola became the first Alaska Native elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. The story of Wounded Knee is not just history, it is a living narrative shaping our future. In addition, the concept of economic development threatens to upend the multidimensionality of Native American culture. The massacre, a tragic result of cultural clash and broken promises, reminds us of human compassion and cruelty. The dominance of federal government involvement in indigenous developmental activities perpetuates and exacerbates the salvage paradigm. State-level efforts such as the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act were attempts to contain tribal land in Native American hands. However, more bureaucratic decisions only expanded the bureaucracy. The knowledge disconnect between the decision-making bureaucracy and Native American stakeholders resulted in ineffective development efforts. The story of Wounded Knee is one of loss, resilience, and the enduring human spirit.